Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. In place of your usually scheduled apocalypse, we have some special stuff because the apocalypse is over. Single tear shed for the apocalypse. But today, we're going to be talking about that most ornery of topics. Something that comes up, I think, a lot. Like, I get asked this constantly. Like, how do we handle it? How do I not let it destroy my group? PvP, quote unquote. So I thought it'd be fun to get John and Andrew to come and hang out and talk to me about this topic, because if you've been watching Apocalypse World, you know one of these two people likes to do adversarial things in games. And yeah, and the other is very experienced at handling it. So what we want to do today is just like hang out and kind of shoot the shit about that stuff, about adversarial player behavior in games, how to make it work. We're going to be here for a couple hours. The first hour we're going to talk about mostly like theory stuff, like, you know, kind of what is PvP and like what kind of stuff constitutes it in game and all that. And then in the second hour when we get back from the break, we'll talk about more of the mechanical stuff, like how games handle it, what games do PvP in a way that's helpful and which games don't help you at all when that comes up. If you have questions, there'll be some time at the end where we'll be covering that kind of stuff. So you can ask in chat, though it may disappear by the time we get around to the question asking thing. I've also got a thread over on Twitter where I'm getting questions from people that I'll be able to keep track of throughout the show. So thanks for coming, John. Thanks for coming, Andrew. Let's talk about the PvP is.
Yeah.
So what? I mean, I guess when someone says to you like, what's the PvP like in this game, this tabletop role playing game? What is that? What do you think of when that topic comes up? What is PvP for you? Let's set a baseline here before we start getting specific.
So for me, I guess where I would go with that is just like, does the game actually provide mechanics that are specific to players, to like interaction between player characters? Like Apocalypse World is a great example where like the moves are very explicitly written to include that. So it's like with manipulating, right? On a 10 plus, you know, with NPCs, this, with players, this other thing. And so I think like it's a game that has a foundation that supports those kinds of engagements between the players. But other games like D&D, it doesn't give you a lot of like unique stuff for engaging with other players. It's just like, okay, well, you fight monsters, you can fight players, I guess, too. Like, it's not necessarily very robustly supported, I suppose. So that would be one of the first places I would look, is just at my game's rules and whether or not it's supporting me.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, you know, in hand with that is also the opportunities and the sort of premise of the game. You know, what types of interactions, you know, in terms of setting expectations, are we creating a band of characters that are all working together towards a common purpose? Are we creating warring factions that are messing with each other through our intermediaries? Are we creating gladiators that duel each other or fight like boxers or something? that kind of core expectation of the game can help understand, you know, what PvP is in a given game. It might be very remote and unlikely given the sort of setup or premise of the game, or it might be constant and high stakes, and there's a huge range of things. And then of course the mechanics can well support or poorly support that, but it can at least set a kind of baseline for what to expect when you play, how much there's going to be, and or how little or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's interesting though, because both of those things, you know, that you both mentioned, they rely on the players adhering to both the mechanical constraints of the game and the premise set forth in the game. Like in Dungeons and Dragons, ostensibly, yes, you're like a team of mercenaries trying to accomplish like a thing, but PvP still happens, and there's no necessary mechanical support for it. And I think that's where people come into trouble. Because players want to pursue that behavior as a recourse to not getting what they want, despite what the game may or may not provide as options.
Yeah, there is. I feel like one of the classic things in gaming is the thief class in classic D&D, and how it was given explicit permission essentially to steal from the other PCs, and that could have been a really bad experience, and a lot of people complained about that in the early days of D&D, I think, and still today. Or people took it as an instruction for, this is what the game is. Like, if you have a thief in your group, this is how things go, and you need to be on guard against this. And the thief player is doing well if they steal more loot from other people on the team. And yeah, from the very origin of the hobby, we had this immediate PvP question, this weird gray area of what's proper play on this point. Is it desirable or not desirable? And there was no really hard answer to that. I think Gygax came down pretty hard on, yes, it's fine, you should totally do that. But in the culture, it never really seemed.
Which, from a design perspective, is kind of a dick move to pull, to be like, yeah, you should totally steal from each other. I'm not going to give you any real means of resolving that as players, but, just go ahead and just do it. It's cool.
Well, and since D&D is totally a game of it is a hammer and all you see are nails, when you catch the thief stealing from you, you can't be like, oh, well, we're going to have a stern talking to with this thief. It's just no, well, you got to fucking stab him in the heart. It's all you got.
It's the only tool you have to resolve that conflict is, yeah.
And that's totally functional play with a lot of groups, especially the early culture of the game. I think it was very competitive and confrontational in that way, and you were pitting your wits against the DM and the other players, and kind of anything goes, and you resolved everything with the dice or by weaseling the DM to do the thing you want to have happen. And but yeah, you get that culture clash when one culture that values that thing, the idea gets passed along to a different culture of gamers that really hates it, and it doesn't work. So yeah, I think you're totally right, Adam. You can have a premise that supports it and mechanics that support it, but without a play group that wants that experience or is invested in it or are going to enjoy it, then it kind of doesn't matter. The social layer trumps all that.
Well, and that's a thing that I think doesn't often come up, because games, for the most part, I would say, don't access the social layer or even really acknowledge or talk about it very much. And I think this is where the clash comes from with PvP, where people have a goal for their character, and the whole concept of role-playing to a lot of people is I'm going to do what my character wants to do. And this is where that I'm not a dick, but my character is, where that comes up, right? And trying to pursue these dual agendas of creating a communal narrative experience, but then also being no, but I'm trying to stay true to my character. And this is where that clash, I think, comes up a lot in groups, where they're well, my character wouldn't stay with the group, or my character would probably do this thing that isn't necessarily the best for the premise that we've come up with together. And so what would you say for someone that's in that situation, where what's more important, the group or the individual character in any given game?
Yeah, I usually talk about that during the setup for a game, or when it's coming up. This idea, the trade-off between freedom and getting everyone kind of getting what they want. And if we decide as a game group that player freedom is what we really want, play any type of character you want, make any kind of decisions you want, you're free to choose whatever you want, but in exchange for that freedom, we have to live with the consequences. And the consequences might be you sort of write your character out of the game by things you've done, or you kill someone else's PC because of choices you've made. And these sometimes kind of undesirable outcomes can happen if we're willing to just follow actions and consequences wherever they lead. And if everyone agrees to that, then it's okay, even if in the moment we're really bummed about it and we're oh man, Rich died or whatever, that sucks, but we also like it because we're doing the thing we set out to do. We're trying to follow this chain of events down these paths. Or I feel you can do kind of compromise the other way and say, okay, you aren't necessarily going to do any and everything that you character might do, or follow any and every action. We're going to have some constraints on this and say, do whatever you want, play your character, but also, stay as a team. Don't attack each other. Let's all try to have similar goals, and put constraints on kind of what types of characters we play and what types of decisions they make. And I feel like as long as you have a clear talk about that in some way, and everyone's expectations are aligned, then you're free to do any of those. They're all up for grabs. There's no particular like best way to handle it.
Yeah, well, and we had that conversation, like, Andrew, we had the conversation prior to playing Apocalypse World about being like, this game can have a tendency in late game to sort of have the characters drift apart, and if you watched it, you could see that happen, where it started very, like, tightly constrained and kind of spun apart. Did you feel, like, playing Gritch, that you had more freedom to take sort of PvP actions, or to take, like, player adversarial stuff seriously because we had that conversation in advance, or was that like mostly like in the moment stuff for you?
No, for me, it's totally about having that conversation. I think if you come up with a concept that isn't going to toe the line of that conversation, which you always need to have with your fellow players, then like that is you making a mistake in the game. Like if I am playing a game where everyone's like, cool, so we're all like a band of like friends and we get along and we're going to go on adventures together and we're always going to be a team, and I'm like, cool, I make the badass loner who hates all of you. Like, no, I have fucked up. Like I have breached that contract that we made, right, where we said
in the same way as if you were playing Dungeons and Dragons and you come to the table and you're like, I'm a spaceman. It's like, okay, well, we could maybe make that work, but technically you kind of goofed. So
yeah, like you're missing one of the fundamental kind of cornerstones of this game that you want to play. So yeah, I would have, if we had been like, hey, we want like the Apocalypse World group to like stick together, this is how we want to do it. For one, I mean, if I picked a brainer, it would be like, okay, but I'm like very explicitly like part of someone's crew, or I would find ways to tie my concept in more closely with the other characters and to keep things more in line. And I don't think I would have been the like psychotic, self-experimenting, mad scientist brainer. It just would not have been the road I would go down, because it would not be appropriate for the experience that we wanted to create. So yeah, having that talk early on was really great, especially if you know that the game has mechanisms and like is gonna kind of, I don't want to say push you in that direction, but allow, like the game is built to include that, then definitely have that conversation. And I think you get really rich stories out of having those kinds of the players like pushing really hard as individuals for, their characters' themes and like the core stuff.
Yeah.
You get great stuff out of it. So I like to try for that. But
yeah, for sure. Well, as a GM, I always feel like a sense of like the pressure kind of coming off when I can sort of take a step back and let the players kind of interact with each other in an adversarial way, which to me brings to mind kind of an interesting thing about this, in that I think it's sort of the like World of Warcraft view of gaming, in that there's two very distinct entities. There's player versus player, and there's player versus GM or whatever, and the two don't really cross over, and if they do, that's when it becomes problematic for gameplay. And I think that that's a false dichotomy, right? Like I think that we've proved that you can have both in the same game without it being a really big deal. You don't have to build the entire premise around one or the other. But like, what do you think that is? Like, why do you think there's that divide? Like, is the GM not also a player? Like, is not all content adversarially PvP?
I mean, I think there are 2 points I would want to make on that. One is that the stakes are different for the players versus the GM, right? Like the GM has like an arsenal of characters, right? And so like, you can send them in to die, or, like you're looking at them through the crosshairs, whereas the player has a very, like in Apocalypse World, again, it's a great example of this. Like the MC has a very explicitly different set of stakes than what the players have. And you're supposed to be really aggressive as the MC, and just like people will die. People in your care, right, in your hands, are basically just waiting to die. Whereas for the players, like it's kind of the total reverse of that. Like you're much less threatened by violence. You're more about pushing one agenda instead of this like overall like clocks ticking on the world thing, you're fighting to stop that. And so when the players interact, like it's a much more honest game, I think, because like the stakes are the same for each of them.
Right, so it's no big deal for Han Solo to shoot 12 stormtroopers, but if Han shoots Luke in the back of the head, it's kind of a big deal because Luke
Yeah,
had some stuff going on. Yeah, okay.
and so when you have those two, like when Luke's player and Han's player come to the table and they're engaged in, like their characters are fighting, like that has so much more like grist to it or whatever, right? Like that's so much more serious than if they fight 12 stormtroopers. I mean, whatever.
Yeah.
So that is a really big factor. Just like what's at stake for the players, the people behind the characters, and then the other thing is the mechanics. Like World of Warcraft is a great example where like you're fighting a boss and it's got like 1,000,000 hit points and blah blah blah, and like whereas two player characters fighting, it's like all those numbers and mechanics are scaled so differently, right? Like the experience is like the kind of GM content is mechanically distinct from the players in terms of like how everything is scaled and built and what kind of experience fighting or engaging with that content is supposed to create. Whereas the players are these like super razor sharp, like highly destructive things.
Right, right. So both the tools that you have as a player to impact change are easier. Like the adversarial stuff the GM has tends to be easier to disassemble, but continues to sort of regurgitate. Whereas with a player, when you kill somebody else's PC, you're negatively impacting them. Not necessarily because they might have agreed with this, but you're negatively impacting the amount of time they've sunk into the game. I guess is the thing. I think that's interesting because I've seen the inverse as being true too, where players play their characters the same way they would run an NPC if they were a GM, where they're just like, I don't give a shit if my character dies. Fuck it, I get a new character, it'll be sweet, right?
Yeah.
But then I've seen the inverse too, and I think everybody's seen this, where the GM is like, no, I spent so long in this NPC, you can't kill him, he vanishes in a magic puff of smoke. Haha, you can. Can I roll? No rolls. He's gone. Too bad. So it's
you're touching on an interesting aspect of this, which is the idea. We keep talking about killing characters, and that's when you bring up PvP, I think that's what like touches on people's insecurities or fears when it comes to this kind of thing, because the stakes are death, and I love my NPC or I love my PC, and I don't want to lose them.
You're taking away my guy. I was
Right.
playing that guy.
And I totally agree, like, because I GM most of the time. Like I tend to play my PC as a NPC and kind of be like, oh, how interesting, they're gonna die now. I wonder who I'll play next. But I think most players don't really feel that way. But the point I wanted to make was the idea of stakes for PvP is super important, and that's another dial you can have, right? You can say like, yeah, we're gonna have this violence, physical violence or whatever between PCs, but you actually can't kill each other. You might just throw that on there, and that some games actually have that in the game system. Like Apocalypse World sort of has that. It's almost impossible to kill a PC straight up. With the mechanics, like and that can change the dynamic a lot too. If you're interested in a game where the PCs don't all get along and don't all align and might come to blows, you can kind of like ease your way into it maybe with less than final consequences on the table. So
people can
be relieved a little bit.
I think you're right about that, and I think that's sort of, I don't want to be over dramatic, but I think it's endemic to role playing games in general that the idea of characters that leap into murderous combat at the first like possible opportunity, right? Where it's like, but again, it's like what Andrew was saying about the hammer and nail situation, right? Where it's like, okay, well, the only tools I have for resolving conflict in a lot of games are, well, I could threaten to murder you, or I could murder you, or we could make a diplomacy roll, which doesn't really do anything. So. And I guess that's something like social conflict is a thing that I kind of wanted to address, in that Like, how do you do things where, like, Apocalypse World has a seduce and manipulate where it's like, I can offer you the carrot or the stick or both. But, like, in a lot of games, how do you do things like diplomacy checks or, like, persuade checks without it being outright mind control? Like, I'm really good at getting people to do what I want, so I'm going to tell you to go kill that guy. Oh, got my roll. Better go do it.
Yeah. I feel like there's like a meta mechanic, which is an actual mechanic in some games, but um, there's always permissions, right? And I think people sometimes forget about this in games where there's a lot of unspoken assumptions, and what we do when we show up at the table is we say what our character says and does, we react to the GM, we roll dice, and that's like all we're doing. But there's also this like social layer and the permissions layer, which says I always have this recourse as a fellow adult with you at talking, having a conversation. I can always be like, actually, I'm not giving you permission to do that, or I'd like to ask for permission to do this thing. That sits on top of everything. So,
well, and we had that come up. We had that come up in Burning Wheel, like Andrew, when you were trying to convince Austin's character of a particular plan of action. I asked Austin, I said, if we allow Andrew to make this roll and he succeeds, then is it okay for you to have your character be convinced that he's right? You don't have to do anything, but like for now, your character feels that way about this thing, and you can choose how you act. And
right, and to me, that's not even like a adversarial thing. It's like a role playing opportunity. We're saying, hey, in this case, like Austin, tell us what your character's like. Are you, when it comes to this issue, are you reasonable? Are you totally unreasonable? Are you open to discussion? Are you closed-minded? Are you violent? Are you patient? Like, it looks like an adversarial thing. Like, oh, there's a danger that another player is gonna like control what your character does.
Get their way.
Yeah, right. God forbid.
Really, it's a chance for you to like tell us what your character's like, and you might say like, no, my character is totally unreasonable and will not listen to any argument about this, and just forget it. It's not going to work.
I mean, do you think that devalues certain types of character then? Like if you play a character that's all about manipulating people, and there's these 3 other special people that your magic powers just don't work on, does it, like, because you can always kill somebody. Like games always give you rules where you're like, well, I don't care what your character's like. They're like a corpse now. But
yeah, I mean, like thematically that often suits a lot of different types of fiction, right? Where when words fail, violence never does.
Yeah.
And I think that's a core theme of a lot of adventure fiction, especially, is that violence solves problems, not cooperation and talking.
Right, it's the Conan approach.
Yeah. So I think most of the time that suits the types of stories that we like to tell. But there would definitely be cases where you were trying to do something different, where violence wasn't the trump card for everything, and negotiation and charm and stuff would actually matter. And in that case, yeah, you would want to have that higher level conversation and say, look, we can't all be totally immune to persuasion.
I feel like that's a failure right from the start, to have a game in which one player really wants to play a tonguey kind of dude, and then their 3 friends at the table are just like interested in that at all, and we're gonna just be violent assholes.
They're not playing the same
around for some reason. Yeah, like that's again that breach of that like initial social contract.
Sure. I mean, we talk about this a lot as the social contract being important and being like very like a big part of like setting the stakes for the game at large, and as important as something like setting or choice of overarching narrative. Then why don't games ever talk about that? Like, why is that not a thing in most games, right? Is it just assumed that we're all supposed to be adults who are capable of navigating shared narrative space together? Or
I think it's like a thing that a lot of people aren't comfortable talking about, and a lot of players, like, if I'm going to engage in this kind of stuff, like if I'm like, I have goals, that my character has goals that conflict with John's character's goals, which has come up in the course of Apocalypse World. And every time I wasn't like, I'm secretly plotting this thing. I was like, John, just so you know, like, my character wants this. This is what I'm going to be working towards. The idea of like keeping secrets from each other, I think, is really detrimental to actually making this kind of play enjoyable, because you want the players to buy in, you want them in on it, and you want this to be something that both players can kind of like narrate up to and build into their story. And so, like, yeah, I don't know. I think I would love to see games be like, hey, you should have here are some things you should talk about before you actually start play, or like this is part of the game. Like talking about these things is part of character creation. I would love to see that. I'm not sure why it's not in a lot more games. Why didn't you put it in your game, Adam? Like as a designer, like honestly, yeah. Like how
I
did
feel
you
like
engage with that, or did you not?
I mean, we sort of, like with Dungeon World, we sort of did the same thing as Apocalypse World did, where we were like, this is the premise of every Dungeon World game ever. Like, you're not necessarily friends, but you work together on a team. The bonds are written in a way to create that kind of like low-level tension, but not straight up like, you killed my dad, I'm gonna get my revenge on you. It's just like, I kind of don't really respect you, or like, I'm wondering what your deal is. And we, like, that's about as far as we went, just to set the premise. But I think that there is a degree of, not like fear necessarily, but I think that some like games are scared to tell, despite being a rule book explicitly for setting out how you play a game, they're scared to tell people how to behave, right? To be like, this is the way you play games successfully. Right? Like I think that like you look at the GM section of most rule books, it's presented as advice because for some reason there's this like sacrosanct idea that you can't tell people like this is how games work.
Or at least how my game works.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, this is how this game works.
I know.
There are certainly games that do talk about this stuff, but they're rare, especially in the mainstream. It's almost non-existent. It was in fashion in the early 2000s from the Forge games, especially, but it got a little bit wider out. But yeah, like actually mentioning the idea, the social contract. Is something that I encountered on the Forge anyway, and that buzzword like at first was thousands of posts of arguing for years, and now it's kind of just part of gamer talk. I think even with people that don't know where it came from or what it directly refers to, people kind of have this general idea now that there's a social contract in play. So yeah, maybe we will start to see it coming back around into rules texts more explicitly. That would be nice. But to comment on what Adam said, I think there is another way to go about it. Besides talking about social contract directly, is that thing like Dungeon World and Apocalypse World do, where they just tell you directly kind of what the expectations are for the game in general. Like when you play a character, this is how you know you're being a good player in Apocalypse World. You play your character as if they were a real person. Blah blah blah. There's like 3 to 4 sentences there about how to do it. So, like, we can still have our conversation about what our group is trying to achieve as this table, but we can also point at the book and say, well, like I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I know how I'm supposed to be operating as a player, and this is how I'm supposed to be operating as a GM, and it's not ambiguous. But then some games have neither. They have no metric of what it means to be a good player of this game, and they have no discussion of social contract, and so it's left up completely to the group dynamic to sort that out.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, I think, because it feels like, and I guess maybe this is why people ask about it so much, is that it feels very unsupported. It feels like a type of play or an element of gameplay at the table that you're kind of on your own in a lot of ways, and so I think that people aren't really sure how to handle it, and so just kind of like take a shot at it. And because the stakes are so high, it's this awkward balance between like you have a ton of like fear that you're gonna lose your character, but the game is kind of just like I don't know, just go ahead and do some stuff, we'll figure it out, and that can be really tricky. So I think I want to talk a little bit more about that idea of adversarial play being less about like specifically like I am killing you, and more about the place where player agendas intersect kind of violently, I guess. Not like physically violently, but they like come into a conflict where you're like, I want this and you want this, and we can't just find a thing that's both of those.
Yeah, and there are games which give you better tools for negotiating those things, but that I find is the most common one. Is just like, either it's the fate of a character, or we got this great item that would be great for my character. Oh, but it would be great for my other character too. So like,
yeah, that's the classic, right? Is the like, well, you find a magic item or a big bag of gold or whatever, and then You're like, well, who gets it? Like, we can't split this thing, and then inevitably the thief tries to steal it, and then the paladin kills the thief, and then somebody gets revenge because they were the thief's best buddy, and then pretty soon everybody is dead and nobody gets the magic item. Or the players, or the group,
magic
or,
sword that you can't use.
exactly, or the group just disbands, right? Like that's.
Yeah, or the players all hate each other so much by the end of it.
And that's a thing that I had a few people ask about too, is like how to prevent. I think we've mostly covered it, but like let's imagine a scenario in which the players have not had this conversation in advance, where you're like 8 months into your Pathfinder game, and you're like, okay, well, we're coming into this situation where we just cannot agree on a way through that fits everybody's character. How do you prevent the sort of PvP situation from getting to a point where people are like, fuck it, I can't even play this with you people. Like, it's just not, like, it escalates out of control. Because I think that's actually a thing that happens to some groups.
Yeah, I think there's two. Oh, sorry, Andrew.
You go ahead.
Like we said, there's sort of two layers, right? There's the social layer and the game layer, which is both like premise and mechanics. And yeah, I don't think there's any reason not to have a brief version of the conversation right then when it comes up 8 months into the game, to say, oh, okay, this is all right. So how do you guys want to handle this? Do you want to roll initiative and do a combat among the PCs? Do you want, let's just figure out how we want to handle this right now. I think of a pitfall that a lot of groups run into, not just with PvP, with any kind of like awkward situation or uncertain stuff, is to try to like keep your poker face, and especially
right.
like try to handle everything inside the game and just sort of hope it works out by sort of nudging, like when this starts to happen, like, oh, a bunch of sturges fly down out of the ceiling. Like, now you guys have to fight together.
Yeah, stop arguing and fight these orcs.
Right. Like that. Like, there's this unspoken thing of you can't ever let let the players see you sweat or whatever.
Well, yeah, don't break character. Being this like.
Yeah.
I don't know where that came from, but it's definitely
terrible
a thing.
Rule.
Yeah.
Definitely break character a lot to talk to people because you're all collaborating.
Yeah. It's so easy to solve problems. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's often extremely easy to solve a problem that way compared to trying to indirectly monkey with something that's essentially a social issue through the game itself. In any way, like if you want to, like, there's like cute person in your game group that you're interested in, and you try to like do something in character to like that's just all it's
so you mean every Vampire the Masquerade game ever run in the history of time?
It's not that it's bad or wrong, it's just that there's this much more functional
there are better ways to
channel to get at what you're trying to get at. You're doing it the hard way if you do it that way. It's not bad or wrong, it's just harder.
I think people come up against resistance to that idea because talking OOC, it feels to some people like breaking immersion, where they're like, why are we even talking about this out of character? We should like talk about it like our characters would talk about it, and then like that's the real like way to get at this. And like I guess I can kind of get that, like that's a big component of it and you want to be like engaged in that way, but it's also like kind of safer for the game and for the group at large to be like, okay, we're gonna have this intense conversation in character, but I don't actually hate you and I don't want to derail the game. I just want us to like get in here and deal with this. But it's tricky.
And having that channel allows you to play even harder, because this happened a couple times in our Apocalypse World game with Frankie and Gritch, where we said some things in character to each other that were pretty harsh, and even like performance wise as gamers, like sometimes we got like really intense, or we were sort of acting mad or acting hurt or whatever. And knowing, like, if you're always in character and immersion is king and everything has to happen in the game, then there can be these weird like resentments and stuff, like, I've been really mad during the game and they just kept pushing my buttons, and they're like, oh, that was great, your performance as a mad person was so good, and
like, no, I was for reals mad.
Right, like nobody knows what's really going on. It's like this weird passive aggressive actor thing. I don't know. But when you have that social layer that you can fall back on,
right,
you can like switch back and forth very rapidly. Even you can be like, oh, my character's really angry right now, this is what she says to you, and you just lay it into them, and you immediately step away from it.
Yeah, it gives some room to kind of like I guess like let that emotion out. Like if you're always kind of caught up in the character, it can get really fucked up. Basically, like your emotions get all tangled in there, right? Like you need that space to just kind of take a breath
Yeah.
and like
Well, and again, like some people really love this. Some people are really into that thing, that experience of being super immersed and getting all entangled and stuff. But it's a trade-off between freedom and happiness, basically. Like, if that's what you want, you got to accept the possibility that things aren't going to go well sometimes, and people are going to get their feelings hurt, and those are the kinds of problems that crop up when you play that way. And if you want to avoid those problems, you kind of can't have it both ways. You can't say we're gonna totally be immersed and always do this and that, and we're never gonna have these problems and da da da. Like that's not how it works. You have to choose.
because although you're pretending to be a wizard, you're not actually a wizard.
Says you.
You can't magically avoid all of the problems.
I mean, I think so. I think that like this all is predicated on the idea that people who play role-playing games are self-aware and mature enough to recognize when these situations come up, or like have that conversation and know in advance the way that they might like feel about things. Because I think that this whole thing, the whole like PvP tension, comes up by mistake or by accident sometimes, where people are like, uh-oh, like I'm having feelings about my character, and shit, they might get killed, but I want to play them, and like, oh my god, what am I going to do? And didn't realize that was going to come up. And I guess it can be hard if you're in a group where you're not like necessarily like socially, like you're playing with people that you either don't know very well or don't know outside of the game. It can be hard to be like, hey, let's all talk as people instead of as elves and wizards and what have you.
Yeah, totally. It can be really hard. Yeah.
I remember like as a younger person, I think I was like maybe 13 or 14 playing some like D&D games. And like yeah, we weren't like very mature people, and we didn't have these kinds of conversations, and like there was the whole fucking range of like people either abusing the fact that they're like basically hiding behind their characters' actions to just be dicks to people.
Fuck you, Steve. I fireball you. Why?
Like,
because you took my lunch.
I'm an arrogant asshole and I want to take the sword, so I'm just going to do it and then hide behind the fact like, oh, well, that's just what my character would do. And like that is just as shitty, right? Even though you're not like breaking character or whatever, this is just as shitty as anything else. Like just hiding behind this idea.
I always forget. I think it might be Ken Hite, but I might be wrong. It might be Greg Stolze. One of the two of them, because I always forget who it is. Somebody called that it's the Nuremberg defense of gaming, right? It's the like, I'm not doing this. My character is. I'm just doing what my character would do. And I love that as a thing. Like I love looking at it and being able to say this is a bad gamer behavior and notice it happening and be like, nope, you're doing that thing. That's the bad thing.
Yeah, and like
and again, like as long as you're willing to accept the consequences, like that can be functional as a thing to do.
Yeah.
It becomes a problem when people want to do that and not have consequences. They want to have all this freedom and do whatever they want and Nuremberg their character and then be like, whoa, hey, I shouldn't have any negative consequences. I just get to walk away scot-free while the world burns down behind me.
Right, yeah.
That's not how it works.
Throw a temper tantrum when they get punished for being shitty.
You just killed my wizard, and now I'm gonna make a bounty hunter who's chasing you. Like, get fucked.
Again, I feel like we're talking about the social layer stuff, particularly like a social failing you see a lot in a lot of group activities of any kind, like the PTA meeting or the whatever you are going to, is when somebody shows up to this group thing in order for them to get what they want. Like that's their agenda. I'm gonna get mine. Is why I participate in this thing. Like your co-rec soccer team. There's that one asshole that just never passes the ball and like is just the worst because they show up to get like I'm gonna have my fun. I'm gonna get what I want. And when that happens in gaming, when PvP is on the table, especially, it can get really awkward because that they're not participating in the group activity. They're using the group
Yeah, they're not playing in good faith, right? And like
Right.
people like that will hide behind these ideas.
I think that's something to self-assess. Like if you're in a gaming group, especially a longer like continuous group together, like think about your actions, think about why you're there, what you're trying to achieve, and are you really trying to just protect yourself emotionally, get what you need out of the game? Is it all like self-focused, or are you there like building the barn with everybody else? And in the process of doing that, like putting up this part of the barn together might be our characters fight to the death.
I was gonna say, yeah. Sometimes the barn is a gladiatorial pit, but
Exactly.
it's still you're still contributing to it together.
Right. We're all, like Andrew said, it's good faith. We can be as adversarial as we want because we're doing it. This is a group activity. It always drives me.
Thing contributes to that greater theme, right? Like it's not
Exactly.
it's not like, oh, we're building a barn and then I start fucking chopping down the barn. It's like,
Yeah, exactly.
Keep your conflict in line with what the game is about, and with the themes of the narrative. With like obviously be honest to your character as well, but think about the story at large, which is what the MC or whatever is always doing, and that's like a big burden for them, right? They have to like kind of consider this, but the players should also be thinking about it. It's not player can't just be stuck inside one person's head. You've got to think of that larger picture and what you're contributing.
Yeah, you're taking responsibility. You're, like we said, it's not, the Nuremberg thing doesn't fly because you're a participant. You're adding everything you say and do adds to this thing we're doing together. And like the band analogy, I think is super apt here too, where if we all try to play in a band together and one person just shows up to wail on their sweet licks and play solos, you don't want that person in your band. You don't want to invite them back. So yeah, it's something to check yourself, think about why you're there, what you're trying to get out of it. And
yeah, and I think that this is one of those things that can be tough because I think that a lot of people assume it's the GM's responsibility to handle all this bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Because they're the GM, and the GM is like, it's your job to keep everybody in line. So if PvP happens, and if somebody starts crying, everybody looks at the GM like, how did you let this happen? Why did you ruin our game? Like
you jerks did it.
Yeah, right? Like in this is it's a scary thing where people think that, and I honestly think, based on my experience talking to people who are new GMs and stuff, this is a thing they're afraid of, where they're like, yeah, but what if I can't control all these assholes? Like, I'm gonna lose my mind here, because they're all just like at everybody's throat. And like, I think that a lot of people don't realize that the game is everyone's responsibility, and that you can, as the GM, be like, I don't care about how this goes, because it's part of the game, and I've got my own stuff going on as the GM. You two that are getting ready to kill each other, you need to discuss this together and figure this out. And I think that this is a thing that people don't, because you don't often see it. Like, it comes up, like in my experience with like Mirror Shades or Swansong or Apocalypse World, like these things come up and we talk about them, but we usually talk about them off screen to maintain that sort of dramatic irony of like continuity on screen. But like when we can feel, because we have experience with this stuff, when we can feel it moving towards that place, I often find that as the GM, I will ask the question like, hey, I'm noticing some tension. I can feel where this is going. Can you two talk about this, please? But I'm not going to be like, how can I save the game? Oh God, please stop fighting.
Because what you're doing is you're providing leadership. That's sort of the role you're in. The GM has this leadership role in most games, but they're not. It's not an authorship role. Like you're not deciding what happens or what ought to happen or what ought not to happen, but you can provide leadership in the sense of like being the one who goes, hang on, can we just take a break here for a minute and talk about this? Or why don't we deal with it this way? Or what do you guys think about this? And you can be the one, the GM can be the one with that bigger picture view,
right?
Ask the right questions and lead the group, with their support, but not have to be, they're not responsible for what happens during a game session. And so many new GMs are, like you said, they're terrified of that they're like putting on a show for the group, and I go live in 5 minutes, and oh shit, I better rehearse. I better get my act ready. But it's much more like leading a team of any kind.
Yeah,
Everyone on the team is going to do stuff.
When it kind of goes back to what Andrew said earlier about stakes, right, and perspective, in that players can get very deeply down a character desire hole where they're like, I have to have this thing that I want, and they're just like fighting tooth and nail to like get it. And the GM has this ability to sort of like be at a remove and to say, okay, I can see this in the context of the greater fiction that we're building here, and I can kind of see where you're going, but your little desperate hole is only a very small part of the greater story. So maybe we need to just like stop and help you work your way out of that in a way that feels, I guess, like legitimate in the game, and not just like, well, we're gonna just walk away from this thing and ignore. Like, I think that's something that you can run into too, where you're like, I can feel tension starting to build. I can see a PvP situation coming up. Let's just pretend it doesn't happen and like ignore it and like not resolve that.
Let's cut to a month later.
Yeah. Let's cut to that part where it's all better now, right? But I think there's something to be said for sticking with it when you have the experience and the ability to just be like focused on this thing and work through it in a way that like you were saying, Andrew, like is in good faith, and not just kind of like, I don't know, you can both roll a d20 and whoever rolls higher gets the thing they want and the other person's dead. Tough shit.
Yeah, and it can still be like I enjoy having the truly out of game conversation about these kinds of things, but it can also still be role playing. You know, it's this opportunity to say your character is like really down in this desire hole. That's a great term. But you can say, okay, Bill, like let's talk about what you're feeling here, Bill. But you can also say like, okay, you know, Urgosh, the orc here, like, is this the type of character that like is this Urgosh? Like, will he absolutely go to the mat over this thing? Is this something that they believe in desperately? And like, are we seeing your true character here? And is this what we're trying to achieve with Urgosh? Or is this something that's just kind of spiraled because of other issues? And if the answer is yeah, no, this I'm trying to play this like desperately greedy guy who wants, you know, everything, and then we can like, then everyone gets on the same page with Bill and is like, oh, cool, okay, now I see what's happening here, and that destructive behavior can sometimes be just sort of twisted a little bit into something that is like, it happens in Burning Wheel all the time, right? Where you have a potentially like horribly destructive thing about your character, but it's right there on the character sheet. Everybody knows about it, and when you do the overly greedy, overly self-centered stuff, it's super functional because we know like, oh yeah, we're on board here. And someone might step in to play your foil, the person who, you know, I'm going to intentionally get in your way and not let you get everything you want. Or gosh, what are you going to do now? And you know,
right. Well, there's a degree, I think in Burning Wheel especially, there's a degree of having two characters explicitly built to engineer points for each other. Like you can make karma or Artha farms of each other's character to be like, you know, explicitly opposed in that way. But again, it relies on setting the circumstances of the game thus that you can keep moving forward.
And to wrap up that point, like that, all that works because we're divorcing our ego and our self-identity from this thing we're doing. That Urgosh's success and failures aren't mine, and what my character is wanting and achieving isn't, their failures are not my failures. That's their story. This is a story about how this character tried to get what they wanted and they didn't.
Right.
And that's an interesting story. But if your ego is tightly connected to your character, then every failure is a failure for you. Every missed attack roll is bad, and you should feel bad.
On a personal level, yeah.
Yeah, like, and again, I think this gets back to that, like, people who GM a lot playing the game, like, because you get used to not having your ego attached to your characters as a GM, because you have so many and they die a lot. But I feel like that's a useful skill for players, especially, is to really care about your character, but it's not like just take your ego out of it and not have your identity and your emotional well-being at stake when you're
like success for a player is telling an interesting story. And like Burning Wheel is a great example of this, right? Where like failure is still supposed to be interesting. Like if you fail a roll, like that doesn't mean that I've done a bad job as a player. I haven't made a mistake.
I
I'm
mean,
supposed to fail rolls. I'm
it
supposed to just
depends.
like make rolls and do stuff.
Yeah, it depends on who you play with, because there are some people that think rolling well is how you are good at role playing games.
Well,
But
and they're missing out on a lot of the fun, right? About
Sure.
like how like struggle is interesting and like immediately getting what you want like is not gonna make for a good story. And so yeah, being able to accept that there are going to be hurdles along the way for your character and that your character could not get what they want, be ready for that outcome and think about how that contributes to creating an interesting story instead of just saying like, oh well, if I don't get this magic sword then like fuck my life, I'm just over, I'm done, I'm quitting. Like
Exactly.
like maybe
that's my the next time I play Burning Wheel, that's my character's belief. I will get this magic sword or fuck my life, I'm done.
I mean, like, yeah, but maybe this is a moment for your character where they realize, like, oh, I don't need a magic sword.
Yeah, wait a second.
A
That
hero.
sword was just a stand-in.
You know, maybe this is their like riddle of steel moment, right?
Yeah.
And that can be totally awesome, and to like be able to like Sean says, like keep your own ego out of your character. You're gonna have a better time playing the game because like sometimes you're just on the chaos plateau and you roll the die and shit goes wrong and you have no control. It's not like you made a mistake.
I mean, you probably could have rolled like better and not suck so bad, but yeah,
get some loaded dice and just cheat.
Exactly, just cheat really hard. Well, and I think that's a thing that we don't see in a lot of games, where games like to pretend like there's no way to win, right? I could find you, I could go upstairs to my shelf and find you like a dozen role-playing games that are like, you can't win or lose in a role-playing game, but you totally can. You can totally fucking win, and you can totally lose. And it's just that those conditions aren't laid out specifically. Like, you can, like you said, you can win a role-playing game by just playing a deadbeat loser who you have a really good time playing them, and they contribute in a really fun way. But you can also win by, like, getting to the highest level fastest and having the most loot, and, like, there's that degree of, like, competition. Like, I play Dungeons & Dragons to win, usually, because the game is built that way. I'm like, I'm just going to be really effective at doing D&D shit, and I want the best gear, and I want to keep winning, because the game has conditions for doing that. And, like, the story is fun, but the game doesn't really support it. So I think maybe it's part of that social contract to sit down and be like, what do we feel like our win condition is for this game? Like, how are we going to win Apocalypse World? How are we going to win Burning Wheel? How are we going to win Dungeons & Dragons, right?
Is Allied victory on or off?
That's right, yeah. What kind of diplomacy are we playing here?
I think it's okay too, just to throw this in the mix, like, because we were talking about having these like setup conversations and setting expectations and all that, which is great. Almost always the answer to every how do I make my gaming better question, it revolves around these things. But I also want to throw out the idea that you don't have to do it all ahead of time and set everything up perfectly and get it all figured out before you start playing, and like, oh, we need to make sure we've set expectations for what lines we're not going to cross and what PvP stuff is allowable and what like we have to have this like litany of things that we all figure out. That's one way to do it, and some people really prefer that, but I think it's also okay for a lot of groups to just know that it's possible to talk about those things and to explore them, and then very importantly, it's okay to not get it right every time, and when things don't go perfectly, instead of it being a failure, like, oh man, the game tonight was so bad because Bill said XYZ, it's
Bill.
The meta expectation you're setting is we're going to try our best and we're not always going to get it right, and when it goes wrong we're going to correct it and try better next time, but we don't have to be perfect every time, and we don't have to set it up ahead of time. We can explore these things as we go.
Yeah, and I think that the resistance to that is often that whole immersion thing where they're like, nobody wants to jump in when I'm like, okay, well, if you're going to take that sword, I guess I draw my sword and stab you. Nobody wants to be like, whoa, hold on. Like, if this happens, then this is going to go in a weird way. Everybody is just like, nope, immersion. You already said you're doing it. Like, it's happening now. Right? And being willing to stop and rewind and be like, actually, okay, I didn't realize that if I drew my sword, you would shoot me with your bow. I hadn't picked that up. Like, I know you were putting those hints down, but I didn't realize violence was on the table. never mind, I'm just going to get really angry instead, or whatever. And it's because I think people fear that idea of being pulled out of character, and like, you can't talk about these things for the fear of breaking immersion or whatever.
So I'm going to bring up something that may not seem fully related, but I think is actually like very close to all of this, which is the whole idea of like the X card or the veil or all that kind of stuff. Like it's a similar idea of just like, well, one, it's a great way, it's a great like kind of thing for setting a tone within a group of like, hey, we're playing a game and like we all respect each other or should anyways, and like here's a way that we can be respectful to one another is by having this thing. But for those not familiar, like the X card or whatever is just a way of, if someone like brings in some content that is like really uncomfortable for you and is something you don't want in your game, and it could just be like, my character's name is Sally, and you're like, oh, I just like I can't handle character's name Sally. Like, please don't make her Sally.
Right.
Or you're like you have like a phobia of something, like, you know,
Yeah,
don't
man,
include that.
giant spiders. Every fantasy game on Earth has giant spiders. So if you like Dungeons and Dragons and you have arachnophobia, your shit is fucked.
Yeah, unless you have this means of like blocking that content, which is like deeply upsetting for you for whatever reason. And part of including this in your group is saying like it's a no judgment thing. Like no one's gonna be like, well, but we really wanted to have giant spiders. You're just like, I'm not comfortable with it, so we're not doing it. And everyone's like, cool, we get that. We don't want to make you uncomfortable. And there's no judgment on the person who tried to introduce spiders because they didn't know. They had no way of knowing. And so like this whole framework of like mutual respect and understanding and like not being judgmental towards people for the content that they bring in, like I think that this kind of like really crummy, like personally vindictive PvP stuff should totally fall into that category of content that you can like rewind and just be like, hey, I'm really not comfortable having that in my game. Can we like be respectful of one another and like not do this and figure out a different way to solve this problem?
I love the idea, and I think this is a really great kind of like note to go to break on, is that the more like respectful and decent you are as a human being to the other players, the more freedom you have to be a complete fucking asshole in character, because
Totally.
you've purchased that right by way of being decent and like setting it up and being like, this is a thing that I would like to explore. Is everyone okay with that? And when everyone buys in and are like, yeah, totally, be the best asshole you could be, Andrew, then you can be like, yes, I'm gonna do it, and I have support of my friends, and this is gonna be a fun experience for everybody. And you know that it's safe to check in later when they're like, okay, you're pushing the asshole thing a little too far, can we talk about that? And be able to work back at it. So I guess it's interesting because I think that, you know, we've talked about a lot of sort of strategies, but they all kind of come from a non-game place. Like we're like, games aren't really helping you with this, so you need to like talk about this and work on it outside of the game. So what we'll do when we come back is we'll talk about some specific examples of games and how they handle player conflict or don't, and we'll take some questions because I know I have a bunch on Twitter now. So stick around for that, and we will be back in just a few minutes. See you soon, everybody.